Hello! Welcome to another AimHi Live. What's today going to be about? So I thought that actually this week would be about COVID-19. But actually, before we start that, I thought I'd just do one that's just quite interesting on what if the world was flat? So a lot of people think that the world is flat, and that's basically wrong. In fact, someone invited me. I got the most amazing email from one of the flat earth people being like, Matthew, I have got the perfect experiment. We are going to prove that the world is flat. You're going to come with us. You're going to be the scientist that at the end looks at the camera and is like, oh, that's funny. It looks like the world is flat. And he was so confident that we were going to prove that the world is flat. And actually, I'm quite keen to do the experiment with him, but we can't do it until the pandemic is over. But I'll film it and tell the other side of the story. It'll be really fun. Anyway, welcome all. Thanks for coming. This is an AimHi Live, so ask questions as we go. I'm just going to talk through some things about science. This one's mainly going to be kind of physics, and it'll touch on various things that you need to know for school, but it'll mainly be about stuff that is really interesting and hopefully entertaining as well. So let's start. Okay, so what if the world was flat? Now, before I answer that, I thought I'd just ask if anyone knows how smooth the world really is. Like, the world is really smooth. I know that we think of it as really rocky and mountainous and so on, but if you shrank the world down to the size of a squash ball like this, it would be as smooth, if not smoother, than the squash ball. All the mountains that we think are massive are just like the tiny little rivets in a squash ball or smaller. Ooh, another cool thing. What is the tallest mountain on Earth? I'll let people write in the comments to see what people think. Fatima, Everest if you're measuring from sea level. Yes, okay, great. Now, that is if you're measuring from sea level. Everest will kind of assume that this kind of looks a bit like Europe. That's a bit like the Iberians, Spain and Portugal. So I have the UK here. Everest over here, pretty tall if you're measuring from sea level. But does anyone know what the actual tallest mountain is if you're measuring from the centre of the Earth? The clue is that it's here. It's here, and actually it's tall. It's further away from the centre of the Earth. The peak of it is further away from the centre of the Earth, and this mountain is called Chimborazo. Mount Chimborazo. Why do people think that one might be taller relative to the centre of the Earth, but actually smaller compared to sea level? How can that be? It's not this underwater, because if it was underwater, then it would still be closer to the centre of the Earth. Although there are some mountains underwater that from top to bottom are far taller than Everest. But no, it's because the Earth, even though it does have a very smooth surface, it has a slight bulge in the middle. So actually, I'm gonna accentuate it here. Yeah, exactly, Fatima, at the equator. Cool. So it's kind of slightly like that, slightly oval, like bulgy at the equator. And the water follows the bulge as well. The water and the ground both bulge at the equator, and so the water level is kind of higher around Chimborazo, so it doesn't seem as high relative to sea level, but actually it's for the peak of it is further from the centre of the Earth. And you know what? Chimborazo is really easy to climb. You can literally just drive right next to it and climb your way up, and you don't have to risk almost certain death like Everest. What would life be like if the world was actually flat? So I'm going to do a little Earth. We'll make it orange. Oh no, I didn't mean for it to be round. Let's have it as square. This is kind of like a cross-section of the Earth, and let's say that all the people are living on top of it, like this. Happily going about their lives, blissfully unaware of how flat it is, or aware. First question, what would the seas look like? What would the water look like on top of the Earth? We know that the water is like flat on top of the Earth, right? If it was flat, then the water would be flat on top of it. The people who believe in the flat Earth theory think, oh, the world is flat and the water is flat on top. But actually, what we know about gravity is that gravity always pulls towards the very centre. So in the same way that when we have around Earth, it's always pulling us towards the center no matter where we are. So it always feels like down is down. So that's down for that person, and this is down for this person, because it's always pulling people towards the very center of all the mass. Gravity pulls towards the center of mass. And so if you have a totally flat Earth, then the center of mass is here, right? Which means that wherever you're stood on the surface of the Earth, you'll get pulled in this direction. And obviously if you're stood right in the center, you'll just get pulled straight downwards. But if you're at the edge, then you'll be pulled in like that. So does anyone have another guess at what shape they think the water might take on the surface of the Earth? If this were the real deal? It wouldn't be quite a sphere. Ah, a Zaya, inward curve. Yeah, exactly. Some water might be towards the edges, but in general, it would all be kind of collecting towards the center. And I'm going to exaggerate it, but it would be kind of like that. And so, because all the water is trying to get as close as it can to the center of mass, and so if it's at the edges, it's going to get pulled away from the edges. So one of the really cool things that I like to imagine on a flat Earth is that if you were in a boat, then you could be at the edge of the Earth, and then you'd have to sail uphill. It'd be so good. And then you'd eventually be like on the top, and then you could see everything, which would be great. Oh, it'd be so good if there was a water bulge. But there's not. What do people think the trees would look like on the surface of the Earth? How would the trees grow? And remember, the two things that drive the way that trees grow is that they grow towards the light, yes, but they also grow away from... What do they grow away from? What do people think? Yeah, they grow away from shade. Cunning. But they do grow away from shade in the same way that they grow towards the light. Oh my god, have you ever seen those things called walking trees? Quick aside for something really important. There are these trees in the world that walk, and these trees can walk towards the sunlight. What they do is they grow these roots like this, diagonally downwards, and if they detect that there's loads of sunlight coming in this direction, then they'll grow more roots down in this direction. And by pulling more roots in this direction, the roots grow downwards, plunge into the ground, and then pull the tree that way. And so the whole of the tree moves towards the light, which is a really good strategy in the rainforest for a tree that can't grow very quickly, because it needs to benefit from the big trees falling over and exposing areas of light and then walking into them. And if you do like a a time-lapse camera, so you take a photograph every day and then you play it like a film, then you can literally see these trees like walking across the forest floor. Here you can see it having actually moved across the forest floor thanks to annews.in. So, back to trees. How would the trees grow across the surface of the flat Earth? What do people think? I'm just going to put one tree in here. We were talking about the thing that they grow away from. The thing that they grow away from is gravity. If they can't figure out where the light is, then they'll just grow straight upwards away from the gravity. So here's a tree that's just growing straight upwards. What do people think the other trees are going to look like? Curved outwards. Yes, Fatima. Cool. Curved outwards away from the gravity. I'm just going to draw it. As I said, wonky. Yes. Actually, they wouldn't be wonky. I still think they'd be like quite. Well, actually, I can't think about what would happen if the world was spinning like that. That might wonkify them. But in general, they'd grow like this. If they're growing away from the gravity. And the further away from the centre you got, the more extreme that would become, until they were just like growing almost along the ground. By the way, as I'm going, just like ask any questions you want. And if we end up on a massive tangent like walking trees, totally fine with that. If you are walking along this surface, then try to imagine what it would be like. You're stood here, and as you walk in this direction, what happens to you? What is the experience of walking in that direction like? Yeah, exactly. You get pulled back towards the center. Really great. And so as you get to here, you're going to start to feel as though you're climbing up a big hill. It's going to feel really, really steep. And by the time you're near the top, you'll be climbing up such a steep hill that it'll feel like you're rock climbing. And then eventually, if you manage to get to the top, you'll manage to haul your hands over the top, pull yourself up, and then you'll be stood like this on the edge, being pulled back towards the center, like this, because the gravity is going to be that way. And then if you were stood on the edge and you jumped off, then, well, let's kind of do it the other way around just so that you can see. So if we flip the world round, because that's how it would feel to you when you're stood here on the edge of it, then when you jumped off the edge of the world, you would be falling for a while, but then it would turn into a slope, and eventually you'd be on a bit of an angle going down the slope until eventually you'd be stood upright again. It'd be so bizarre. It would be like, what's that old film called? Monsters, Inc., where they go through the doors and all the gravity changes. It has an image of people getting sandwiched by the earth. As in stuck between two layers. Yeah, I guess if there were two flat earths, you'd definitely get stuck between the layers. That would be the nightmare. Although actually, if you had a structure where it was like this, so if you had two flat earths like this, but they were somehow held apart by some little beams, because obviously if they weren't held apart, the gravity would just slam them into one another and you would end up with a human sandwich. But yeah, if you were stood here, obviously it'd be on a bit more of an angle, but if you were stood there, then you'd be attracted downwards by gravity. But if you jumped hard enough and you managed to get to the middle, then the gravity of the one above would start pulling you, and you might end up stuck to the other one above, which would be seriously cool. Quick aside, going back to the flat earth theory. So the thing about the flat earth theory is that it's amazing how the arguments have been built to help to sustain people who believe the theory. So there are some amazing things that people have come up with to try and do gymnastics with physics, basically, to try and make it make sense that the earth is flat. What do you think the explanation is from flat earthers that humans are not stood at an angle like this wherever they are on the earth? They have an explanation for why it feels to all the humans that they are just being pulled downwards all the time, straight downwards. Does anyone have any ideas? And if you're just joining us, this is an AimHi live, and so at the moment I'm explaining what would life be like if the world was actually flat, and I just asked the question, how do the flat earthers explain the fact that gravity is constantly pulling people downwards, even though we can see that the center of gravity of a flat earth is in the middle, and so people should be being pulled towards the middle, and so people would end up struggling to stay at the edge because they're being pulled towards the center. But the flat earth people have a theory. What is that theory? What do people think? Someone's put that there's an ice barrier around the edge, and the ice barrier is what they think keeps the sea in, because otherwise they think that the sea would fall off the edge. But that doesn't have anything to do with gravity. The explanation for gravity for them is a bit like being in a lift. So if you're in a lift, or an elevator as it's called in American English, and you're going upwards, you feel yourself being pushed down into the floor, right? As the floor is pushing up into you. And so the idea that they have is that the earth is just constantly accelerating upwards. Constantly. Always. And that is genuinely what they believe, and that's why they think that we're not all stood at an angle. Which is mad. You would think, well, but it's I don't know, I still appreciate that there are people in the world who have like different ideas about things. Oh, there's been a question from Jasmine. What would the atmosphere be like on a flat earth? Yeah, again, that is a really good question. I think the atmosphere would be similar to the sea. So let's pretend that this is the flat earth now, this one at the top, and let's ignore the ones below because they've got a bit messy. So again, you've got the center of gravity here, and so all the gases in the atmosphere are going to be getting sucked towards the center. And so you would expect that you'd have like a thicker atmosphere near the middle and a thicker atmospheric pressure. The pressure of the atmosphere is actually pretty big. We're just used to it, but the pressure on your hand from the air alone is equivalent to a full-grown adult human stood on top of your hand at all times. But the thing is, the pressure on the inside of your hand is pushing against that as well, so you actually don't really feel it. But if you had like radical changes in pressure, because most of the atmosphere, maybe we can use the spray can for this. So if most of the atmosphere is collected around the middle, and then you've just got little bits of atmosphere out towards the edge, if you've got all the atmosphere concentrated in the middle, then you might feel the effects of like change in pressure, and the weather would be bizarre as well. But there's actually even more to this, because it's the same reason as why Mars doesn't have an atmosphere. Does anyone know why Mars doesn't have much of an atmosphere? I'm going to just draw this sphere while I wait for people to answer. So Fatima says that maybe something bashed the atmosphere away. It's not that, because the atmosphere would stick around because you've got this big gravitational mass of Mars pulling it in. It's that something else is bashing it away. Oh wait, Fatima, did you say something bashed it away? Because if so, sorry, as soon as you said that, I was immediately thinking of like a large solid object. But actually, you are right. It's the solar radiation and particles coming off the sun that blow it away. And the reason why that doesn't happen here is all to do with us having a protective magnetic field. Mars doesn't really have a magnetic field because, well, I'll explain that in another one. But on Earth, we have the northern lights and the southern lights are these beautiful representations of the fact that the magnetic field is protecting us from all of those particles coming off the sun. All of that energy, the light in the sky is from that force field in action protecting our atmosphere. That is for another time, but that is a cool thing to think about. Right, here is another sphere which I'm going to think of as the Earth, and let's think of it as our Earth, so round. There is actually another theory that the Earth is hollow. There are loads and loads of people who think this, and they basically think that all the rich people live on the inside, and that there's a little sun in the middle that provides them all with light, and that everyone else has to live on the surface, and blah blah blah. Anyway, it's all the same classic stuff. Earth's not hollow. It would be cool if it was, and the reason it'd be cool if it was is because of this. So, has anyone ever heard of a thing called Newton's sphere, or Newton's shell? That's what it's called, Newton's shell. Again, if you're just joining us, this is an AimHi Live, so throw in any questions that you want to ask, and know that this is interactive and this will be steered by whatever people ask. Newton's shell is this idea that if you had a huge shell in space, so like a planet, but hollow on the insides, just with a thin layer on the outside, and if you stood on the inside at the edge of it, then yes, you'd be pulled by gravity down to here because there's some mass that's beneath you, but actually most of the mass is above you, and that most of the mass above you is pulling you upwards, but it's further away, and because it's further away, it's pulling you upwards exactly the same as this is pulling you downwards. And so you have a bizarre situation where you are completely weightless. And so if the Earth was hollow, then you could just swim through it. If it were hollow and full of atmosphere that you could swim against, you could just swim through it as if you're floating because you'd be completely weightless. Obviously, if you're in the middle, you'll be weightless because when you're in the middle, you're pulled equally from every side, from all the mass. But try to imagine what it's like if you're near the edge. Just to explain it one more time. If you're near the edge, then this mass here is closer to you, so it's got more gravitational pull in that sense, but it's also smaller. And this load of mass is further away from you, but it's also bigger. And so they cancel out, and so you're being pulled equally in that direction and that direction, and so you can just float around, which is pretty cool, I think. Anyway, that's the end of this AimHi Live in terms of the stuff I was going to cover. Has anyone got any questions or thoughts? And also, thanks for coming along, because we're just kind of trialling these at the moment and trying to work out the best way of doing them. So any comments or thoughts would be great. We're going to do them at 2 p.m. every day this week. That's when I'm going to do them, and then some other people are going to do them at other times as well. Let me know what you think, and let me know any questions. So someone's asked a question about why do I believe that the Earth is flat, despite all the science. I think that there's a strong tendency in humans to want to believe that, because life is naturally a struggle. Life is naturally a struggle. That's the way that life always has been and always will be, really, because that's how we've evolved. And there's a really strong tendency for people to want to believe that the reason it's a struggle is because there's some kind of organized thing that's working against them. And the idea that there's this big conspiracy that the world is flat and it's being kept a secret from them is something that's really, really attractive to people, because it's suddenly everything becomes right in their mind. They're like, oh my God, this is why life is so hard. This is why everything's so difficult. This is why the world is such a mess. This explains why politics is broken, why there's like the refugee crisis, the climate crisis, everything. And suddenly they start to see that the reason for everything is because of this one idea. And then once you get inside it, like as I was talking about before with the logic of like the Earth accelerating upwards, people, like, it all starts to prove itself. And so people get stuck in the thinking of it. Oh, another question. What's the topic tomorrow? Great question. We were thinking of theming this week around COVID stuff, but not around the COVID-19 actual news. We were thinking of doing it around interesting things connected to that. So, for example, like, where do diseases come from? Are there cases, because obviously everyone thinks of bacteria, viruses, and fungi and so on as being quite bad if they get into your body, but are there some cases where there are actually good versions of those things as well? We were thinking of doing something like that, something quite biology from my side, and then there were some other people who were going to do stuff that was more about the politics of it and things. But what do people think about? Got a question from Jasmine. How do you know when the other AimHi sessions are? Great question. Okay, we're building this as quickly as we can, so we're still trying to figure it out. But if you go on the website, which is www.aimhi.co, aimhi.co, then there's a calendar page, and we're updating it as much as we can. But for now, I'm going to do mine at 2 p.m. every day this week. If there's some kind of technical difficulty, it might end up at 2:30, but basically aiming for 2. And then as the weeks go by, we're going to start to put them at different times as well. Oh, and the other thing is, check out the AimHi Instagram, which is just at AimHi Live. And then there's my Instagram as well, which you might already know about, which is at Matthew Shribman. And I'll be promoting the AimHi stuff on there as well. Thanks so much, everyone. Thank you for coming. I really enjoyed this one. Thanks for coming, and hopefully see you tomorrow. Ciao.